My parents told me I wasn't half the woman my sister was, and today they proved they meant it. I arrived at her six-figure wedding only to find my seat was a folding chair in the service hallway. My father walked past me, didn't even look at my face, and whispered, "Stay out here. You don't have the status to be seen with us tonight." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just pushed that cheap metal chair back and walked toward the exit. My family thought they were finally putting the failure in her place. They didn't know that the only reason they were allowed in this ballroom was because of a corporate favor I signed off on months ago. They wanted me to leave? Fine. But as the new majority owner of this hotel chain, I'm taking the ballroom back with me. They're about to find out that when you kick the architect out of the room, the whole house comes down. The air in the service hallway was cold, smelling of industrial floor cleaner and stale laundry, a surgical strike of disrespect that stood in sharp contrast to the scent of expensive lilies and Wagyu beef drifting from the ballroom just 10 feet away. I sat on a rusted metal folding chair, my $4,000 silk gown pooling around my heels like a ghost of the life I actually lived. I looked at the hand-lettered place card taped to the back of the chair. Maya Sterling, hallway overflow. It was a medical shock to my system, not because I was surprised, but because of the sheer, permanent foreclosure on any shred of human decency my family still possessed. Inside the ballroom, my sister Elena's wedding was a glow of opulence that had cost nearly $500,000. I could hear the muffled sound of my father's voice, projected through a high-end sound system, delivering a toast that felt like a surgical strike against my soul. "To Elena," he boomed, his voice thick with a social mask of pride. "The light of our lives. A woman of vantage who has always known her worth. She is the true legacy of the Sterling name. Some people are born to lead, to be seen in the glow of the spotlight, and some are simply meant to be the support beams that stay hidden in the dark." The mirror paradox of his words was almost sickening. He was talking about me, the ghost sister who had been janitor to their reputations for years. He didn't know that the support beam he was mocking was the only reason his bank accounts weren't in permanent foreclosure. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors creaked open. My father stepped out, looking for a quiet place to adjust his tie. He stopped when he saw me sitting in the dim light of the hallway. He didn't look guilty. He didn't offer a resolution for the seating arrangement. He just looked at me with a status flip of pure contempt. "Still here, Maya?" he asked, his voice a surgical strike of cold indifference. "I thought you might have had the grace to slip out the back. You look ridiculous in that dress, sitting in a service corridor. It's a waste of silk on someone who isn't half the woman your sister is." "I was invited, Dad," I said, my voice a calm resolution that seemed to rattle the social mask he was wearing. "I'm family. Family doesn't sit with the mops and the spare linens." "You're a liability, Maya," he snapped, his face twisting into a mask of medical shock at my defiance. "Elena's new in-laws are the owners of the Aether Group. They expect vantage. They expect a family that radiates glow. They don't need to see the daughter who failed out of the executive package life we tried to give her. Stay out here. Don't ruin her night. You don't have the status to be seen with us." He turned on his heel and walked back into the glow of the ballroom, the door clicking shut with a sound like permanent foreclosure. I sat in the silence for a long moment, the throbbing medical shock of his words finally settling into a cold, hard resolution. They wanted me to be a ghost? Fine. They wanted me to stay in the shadows? Perfect. But they had forgotten one very important surgical strike of a detail. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I didn't call a friend. I called the powerful boss who actually ran the Aether Group, the man Elena thought was her new father-in-law's partner, but who was actually my lead financial strategist. "This is Maya," I said, my voice assuming the sovereign tone I usually reserved for boardrooms. "Execute the status flip. The Sterling family just forfeited their vantage point. I want the deed to this hotel moved from my private trust to my active holding company. And tell the venue manager I'm exercising the permanent foreclosure clause on tonight's event. I want everyone out of my building in 20 minutes. I pushed my metal chair back. The screech it made against the concrete floor was the most beautiful, surgical strike I had ever heard. I stood up, smoothed my gown, and walked toward the exit. They wanted me to leave the wedding? I was doing them one better. I was taking the wedding with me. The double doors of the grand ballroom remained closed, But they were no longer a barrier. They were a permanent foreclosure on the bridge between my old life and my new vantage. I walked away from the service hallway, my heels clicking against the cold tile with a resolution that felt like a surgical strike against the humiliation I had just endured. I didn't need to stay and watch the glow of the reception fade. I already knew the status flip had been initiated. Behind me, the muffled sound of a string quartet was suddenly replaced by a jarring, high-pitched medical shock of feedback through the sound system, followed by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. I reached the main lobby, where the hotel manager was already frantically whispering into a radio. He saw me, the woman he had seen on the ghost security logs as the primary owner of the Aether Group, and he visibly paled. He didn't see a janitor or a hallway cast-off. He saw a sovereign who could end his career with a single surgical strike of a pen. I didn't stop to talk. I simply nodded once, a gesture of permanent foreclosure on the evening's festivities. As I stepped out into the night, the valet didn't bring around a mid-sized sedan. He brought around a custom-built, armored limousine that signaled a status flip to everyone standing near the entrance. I sat in the back watching the glow of the hotel through the tinted windows. Inside, I knew exactly what was happening. The lights would be flickering to a dim, emergency setting, a medical shock, to the high society guests who were currently tucking into their second course. My phone buzzed. It was a surgical strike text from Elena. "Maya, what did you do? The power is out. The staff is telling everyone they have to leave. My father-in-law is furious. You're ruined!" I didn't reply. I watched as the front doors of the hotel burst open and the powerful bosses of the city began to spill out onto the sidewalk in a state of medical shock. They looked like ghosts in their tuxedos and gowns, shivering in the night air as the resolution of their perfect night evaporated. Among them, I saw my father. His social mask was completely shattered, his face a mirror paradox of confusion and rage as he tried to demand answers from a security team that no longer recognized his vantage. He was waving his arms, shouting about status and sterling legacy, but to the guards, he was just another janitor of a guest who needed to be cleared from the premises. Then Elena appeared, her white silk dress catching the glow of the streetlights. She was crying, her social mask of the perfect bride, smeared with mascara and medical shock. She looked toward my car, her eyes narrowing as she realized the resolution of the situation wasn't a technical glitch, but a deliberate surgical strike. The limousine pulled forward slowly, coming to a stop directly in front of them. The window rolled down just an inch, enough for them to see the vantage I now held, but not enough to let their ghost voices inside. "You told me to stay in the dark, Dad," I said, my voice a calm resolution that cut through the noise of the crowded sidewalk. "So I decided to bring the dark to you. It turns out the Aether Group doesn't appreciate janitors who treat the majority shareholder like an overflow guest." "Maya, you can't do this!" Elena shrieked, her voice a medical shock of desperation. "This is my wedding. My glow! You're just jealous because you aren't half the woman I am." "You're right, Elena," I replied, the window beginning to roll back up in a slow, permanent foreclosure on her tantrum. "I'm not half the woman you are. I'm the woman who owns the chair you're standing on. And as of right now, you're trespassing on my property." As the car pulled away, the surgical strike was complete. I looked back through the rearview mirror to see the sovereign, sterling family standing on the curb, surrounded by the ghost of their former status. The mirror paradox was finally clear. They had tried to put me in the hallway to hide me from the glow, only to find themselves standing in the street while I became the light. The status flip wasn't just about a wedding. It was a permanent foreclosure on their ability to ever look down on me again. The sun rose over the city with a cold, unforgiving glow, casting long shadows across the Sterling family's breakfast table, a table that felt like a permanent foreclosure on the joy of the previous day. My parents and Elena sat in a state of medical shock, their social masks discarded and replaced by the raw, pale skin of people who had spent the night staring into the abyss of a status flip they couldn't explain. The wedding dress, a $20,000 ghost of a dream, lay crumpled on a chair in the corner, a reminder of the surgical strike that had ended the reception before the cake could even be cut. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic resolution of a doorbell. My father, moving like a janitor who had lost his purpose, shuffled to the door. He returned moments later, clutching a thick manila envelope, his hands trembling with a medical shock that seemed to vibrate through his entire frame. "It's from the Aether Group," he whispered, his voice a ghost of the authoritative boom he had used to humiliate me in the hallway. Elena snatched the papers, her eyes darting across the text as she looked for a resolution to the nightmare. Instead, she found a surgical strike of legal reality. It wasn't an apology. It was a bill for damages to corporate reputation and a permanent foreclosure notice on the Sterling family's primary investment account, which had been used as collateral for the wedding's executive package. "They're charging us for the lost revenue of the entire hotel wing," Elena shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch of medical shock. "And look at this. The signatory on the status flip order. It's not a board. It's a single person. The sovereign." Maya wasn't lying. She didn't just know people at Aether. She is Aether. My mother leaned back, her face a mirror paradox of regret and terror. "How?" "We watched her fail for years. We saw her ghost bank accounts. We told everyone she was just a janitor for a small tech firm. Because she let us see what she wanted us to see," my father said, his voice dropping into a resolution of pure defeat. "She didn't fail. She was building a vantage point we couldn't even fathom while we were busy making her sit in the hallway. We treated the architect of our entire financial world like an overflow guest." Just then, my father's phone chimed with a notification. It was a link to a surgical strike article in the Global Financial Chronicle. The headline read, "The Sovereign Unmasked, Maya Sterling, revealed as powerhouse behind Aether Group acquisition." Below the headline was a photo of me, not the ghost in the hallway, but the powerful boss in a charcoal power suit, looking out over the city with a vantage of absolute control. The article detailed my net worth, a number so high it created a physical, medical shock in the room. It mentioned my surgical strike investments in the very companies my father and Elena's new husband worked for. Every status symbol they had ever bragged about was, in reality, a ghost supported by my private capital. "She owns the firm," Elena whispered, the glow of her wedding day arrogance completely extinguished. "If she exercises the permanent foreclosure clause on our family trust, we have nothing. We're janitors in our own lives." A second envelope was tucked inside the first. It was a personal note from me, written on heavy, cream-colored stationery that radiated sovereign authority. "To my golden family," it began. "You spent years telling me I wasn't half the woman Elena was. You wanted me to stay in the hallway so I wouldn't ruin the glow of your perfection. Well, the resolution is simple. I've decided to take your advice. Since I'm so unworthy of your table, I've moved all your assets into a secondary ghost account under my control. You can keep the house for now, but consider yourselves janitors on my property. If you want to see the architect, my office is open on Monday. But don't expect a seat in the boardroom. I believe there's an extra folding chair in the hallway." The medical shock in the room was absolute. The status flip was no longer a threat. It was a permanent foreclosure on their reality. My father looked at the note, then at his daughter, realizing that the mirror paradox had finally shattered. They had tried to hide the ghost in the hallway, never realizing that the ghost was the only one keeping the lights on. The glass elevator ascended the side of the Aether Tower with a smooth, lethal resolution, offering a vantage of the city that made my parents and Elena feel like ants in their own kingdom. They stood huddled together, a medical shock of anxiety radiating from them as they prepared to face the daughter they had relegated to a folding chair just 48 hours prior. My father kept adjusting his tie, his social mask slipping every time the floor numbers chimed, while Elena clutched her designer purse as if it were a shield against the permanent foreclosure of her dignity. When the doors opened to the executive floor, they didn't find a ghost or a janitor waiting for them. Instead, they stepped into a lobby that hummed with the energy of powerful bosses and high-stakes surgical strikes. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows were the very people Elena had spent months trying to impress, the elite investors and the CEO of the firm her husband worked for. But they weren't leading the room. They were standing in a semicircle, listening intently to a woman who sat at the head of a massive obsidian table, woman who held the glow of the entire room. "Maya?" my mother whispered, her voice a medical shock of disbelief. I didn't stand up. I didn't offer the executive package of a warm welcome. I simply looked up from the ghost ledger I was reviewing, my expression a cold resolution of professional indifference. "You're late," I said, my voice echoing with a sovereign authority that made my father flinch. In this building, a 5-minute delay is a surgical strike on productivity. But I suppose you're used to hallways, so you didn't think the timing mattered. Elena stepped forward, her face a mirror paradox of tears and fury. "Maya, stop this. You've ruined my husband's career. You've put a permanent foreclosure on our trust fund. The Aether Group just sent us a bill that we can't pay. Tell these people it's a mistake. Tell them you're just our sister." One of the investors, a man my father had once begged for a Vantage meeting with, turned to Elena with a look of pure medical shock. "Your sister? Ms. Sterling is the majority stakeholder of this entire conglomerate. She is the architect of the merger you're currently standing in. If she says there's a debt, there's a debt." The status flip was so violent that my father had to lean against the wall for support. He looked at the men he worshipped and realized they were nothing more than janitors in my world. The glow he had chased his entire life was radiating from the daughter he had tried to hide in the service corridor. "Maya," my father stammered, his social mask finally disintegrating. "We didn't know. If we had known you were this, we would have never. If you had known I was rich, you would have been kind." I interrupted, the surgical strike of my words silencing the room. "That's not a resolution, Dad. That's a confession. You don't value people. You value status. You wanted sovereign children, but you only had eyes for the one who looked the part. You ignored the one who was actually doing the work." I stood up, and for the first time, I saw the mirror paradox reflected in their eyes. They were the ghosts now. "I have a board meeting to lead," I said, signaling to the security detail. "The permanent foreclosure on your accounts remains in effect. However, I've decided to be more generous than you were at the wedding. I won't make you stand in the hallway. You can wait in the lobby with the rest of the janitors." As they were ushered out, the medical shock on their faces was the only resolution I needed. The architect was busy building a world where they no longer mattered. The medical shock of the Sterling family's new reality set in on a Monday morning that felt like a permanent foreclosure on their former lives. My father and Elena didn't arrive at the Aether Tower in a chauffeured car. They arrived on a city bus, their social masks completely stripped away by the weekend's headlines. They were no longer the powerful bosses of the elite social circles. They were debtors entering a surgical strike of a contract I had drafted to keep them from total bankruptcy. I watched from my vantage point in the executive suite as they walked through the lobby, security gate, a gate that only opened because I had authorized their janitor-level access. Elena was still wearing her designer heels, but they looked like a mirror paradox against the gray concrete of the service entrance. Her glow was gone, replaced by the pale, frantic resolution of a woman who realized that her 6-figure lifestyle had been a ghost, funded by the sister she had mocked. "Welcome to the team," I said, my voice projecting through the intercom in the training room where they had been told to wait. "Since you've spent so much time worrying about status and vantage, I've decided to give you a front row seat to how it's actually built." My father looked up at the camera, his medical shock turning into a desperate resolution. "Maya, please. We can talk about this. I'm your father. You can't seriously expect me to work in the mailroom." "I'm not expecting you to work in the mailroom, Dad," I replied, the surgical strike of my tone cooling the air. "The mailroom requires organization. You're going to be working in the archive basement, the high ghost ledger department. You'll be digitizing the very files that helped me build this empire while you were busy telling me I wasn't half the woman Elena was." As for Elena, I had a special status flip in mind. "Elena, you'll be the assistant to the executive package coordinator. Your main task? Managing the seating charts for our upcoming global summit. Since you're such an expert on who belongs in the hallway and who belongs at the table, I thought you'd be perfect for the job." The medical shock on Elena's face was the most honest resolution I had ever seen from her. She was being forced to serve the very powerful bosses she had spent her life trying to pretend she was. The permanent foreclosure on her ego was complete. She was now a janitor of logistics in a world where I was the sovereign. Throughout the day, I watched the internal security feeds. I saw my father struggling with a scanner, a man who once commanded boardrooms now reduced to a ghost in a basement office. I saw Elena being snapped at by a junior analyst because she didn't understand the vantage of a digital seating grid. Every time they felt the sting of a surgical strike from a superior, they were feeling the reality I had lived for 20 years. The mirror paradox was finally balanced. They had tried to hide me in the dark to preserve their glow, but now they were the ones living in the shadows of my success. I wasn't doing this out of pure cruelty. I was doing it to provide a resolution to their arrogance. If they want to be part of this family again, I told Julian as we reviewed the evening reports, they have to learn that the architect doesn't just sit at the table. She builds it from the ground up. The status flip was no longer just a corporate move. It was a character surgical strike. The Sterlings were finally working for their glow. The night of the global summit arrived, not with a medical shock, but with a radiant, undeniable glow that illuminated the entire Aether tower. This wasn't a wedding. Reception built on social, masks, and stolen dividends. It was the resolution of a decade of silent labor. As the sovereign of the evening, I stood on the mezzanine, looking down at a ballroom, filled with the world's most powerful bosses, all of whom had traveled thousands of miles for a vantage point within my circle. Below, near the entrance to the main dining hall, I saw the status flip in its final, most poetic form. My sister Elena was standing by the velvet ropes, dressed in a professional, modest black suit, the uniform of the architect's staff. She wasn't the star of the show. She was the one checking digital ghost ledgers and ensuring that every dignitary was seated according to the precise, surgical strike of my logistics plan. There was no medical shock on her face tonight, only a focused, quiet resolution. For the first time in her life, she was earning her place in a room rather than demanding it. My father stood nearby, acting as a liaison for the archival displays. He was explaining the vantage of our new tech initiatives to a group of European investors, his voice devoid of its former sovereign arrogance. He had spent 6 months as a janitor of data in the basement, and the experience had been a permanent foreclosure on his vanity. He finally understood that the glow of the Sterling name didn't come from the labels on their clothes, but from the integrity of the work they produced. As the keynote began, I walked down the grand staircase. The room fell silent, a surgical strike of respect that no amount of money could buy. I passed by the front table where my mother sat, looking at me not as a ghost or a disappointment, but with a medical shock of genuine, humbled pride. She had finally seen the mirror paradox. By trying to dim my light to make Elena shine, she had almost lost the only person capable of saving their legacy. I reached the podium and looked out at the faces of my family. They weren't in the hallway tonight. They were in the room, but they were there as part of the architect's team, not as her masters. Success isn't about where you are seated, I said into the microphone, my voice a calm resolution that carried to every corner of the hall. It's about who you are when the lights go out. Many of you know me as the sovereign of Aether, but I started as the ghost at the end of the table. I learned that a status flip is only possible when you stop seeking the glow and start becoming the light itself. After the speech, as the powerful bosses moved toward the terrace, Elena approached me. She didn't try to use her social mask to charm me. She simply handed me a glass of water and whispered, "The seating for the VIP lounge is complete. Maya, everyone is where they belong." I looked at her, seeing the mirror paradox finally resolve. "Thank you. Elena, you did a good job." The medical shock of her smile was small, but it was real. The permanent foreclosure on our rivalry was finalized. The Sterlings were no longer a family of ghosts and janitors hiding from the truth. We were a family rebuilt by a surgical strike of reality. Walked onto the balcony, looking out at the city I now helped lead. The glow was everywhere, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a mask. It felt like home.